They left me in a freezing barn to die. The words were a simple, petty cruelty when I first imagined them, an image sharp as a broken key. But they became a fact of my body by the time the sky began to pale and the first thin light found the hay. My coat had been taken. The wool sweater I had wrapped around my shoulders was damp with straw and something older. And my hands had swollen until my wedding band pinched like a law I could no longer read. The cold had a geometry. It made the world small and flat. It drew a line under every memory I could still name, and left only the immediate arithmetic of breath. I kept my eyes open because closing them felt like consent. My breath had the taste of metal. Every small sound was loud. The slow drip from a hole in the roof. A mouse arguing about his business somewhere in the corner. The wind rubbing the boards like a hand searching for something it had lost. Outside, the field was white and empty. The sky was a bruise that would get paler. In the distance, a road was only a suggestion of gray that ran like a promise I'll never collect. I had not planned to be helpless. I had planned calculation. I had planned evidence, lawyers, a morning that would begin in a courtroom and end with signatures and a balance sheet. I planned so well that the plan itself became a shield. But plans have a brittle edge when the people around you, especially the ones you loved, decide to sharpen it into something else. 3 weeks earlier, when the world was still mostly ordinary and my kitchen still smelled of lemon and bread, I had heard them. It had been an accident, as most truths are in the beginning. I was in the sitting room, the cup of tea cooling beside me, when my phone buzzed on the side table. It had been on the dining chair. I had not expected a call at that hour. I picked it up, and because my hearing had a way of picking out what wanted to be heard, I listened instead of answering. "It's done," Ethan said on the other end of the small, muffled line. He sounded pleased, like a man who had discovered a shortcut through a city he did not intend to leave. Jessica laughed, a short, brittle sound, and said, "She won't notice until it's too late. The power of attorney goes through next week. The bank already flagged the transfers, but Ryan smoothed them. We were careful." Ryan, his voice was oily and unfamiliar from the start, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a mouth clearing. Margaret doesn't have any idea how to read a statement. This is easy. One more push and it's done. I sat very still. There is a peculiar kind of cruelty in overhearing the end of yourself. The syllables form more slowly, like someone reading your obituary aloud between sips of tea. I did not call them. I did not storm in. I sat and let the last heat of the tea go cold in my mouth. When the call ended, I turned the phone over, thumbed through messages, until I found the transfer notice Ethan had sent earlier that week. A small sum, supposedly for home repairs, that had the routing of a stranger. The numbers didn't add up. The handwriting on the margins of my bank statement, where my son had added cheerful notes, now looked like a map to a house I did not own anymore. I kept that morning with me the way other women keep wedding photos. I held it up to the light and saw the cracks. I had been thrifty my whole life. I had saved by habit and by necessity. My husband had taught me how to read a ledger and how to measure a boil of soup precisely. Losing money felt like losing the ledger itself, the record of a life. But there was something more than money at stake. They treated me as a deposit to be drained, as a story no longer worth telling. The idea of being erased with polite words and signatures bruised something older than my bank account, the fact that my son had decided I was expendable. I called Catherine the same day. She is the kind of woman you trust because she understands that laws are scaffolding for people, not for paper. She came the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a look that made me sit up straighter than any court summons ever had. "You did the right thing by not ramming the door down," she said, folding her hands on the Formica table like a judge who had never been surprised. "Agitation makes errors. We collect, we reveal, we let the facts do the shouting." "Facts shout differently when they're stitched over," I said. "They whisper." Catherine's mouth thinned. "We will make them shout. I can put an injunction on the accounts pending forensic review. But for that, we need proof that someone outside the family, has been receiving transfers meant for you. I will need all your statements, any letters, anything that came from Ryan." "I have the letters," I said, thinking of a thin stack of envelopes I had kept in the top drawer for reasons I could not explain. They were the sort men like Ryan used: flattery, pity, small promises of quick returns. Jessica had signed one of them with an affectionate phrase that tasted like varnish. "And I want custody of Sophie if that's at all possible. I will not let them take her into that." Sophie, my granddaughter, was 12 then. Her name in my mouth was a small private prayer. She woke up before the rest of the house, drew pictures of houses with high fences and empty porches. When things had been hard between Ethan and Jessica before, Sophie had been the gravity they orbited around, small, insistent, unavoidable. My fear was not abstract. It was a child's thin voice calling from upstairs, asking whether morning cereal would be full of raisins. They were using Sophie like a pawn. They framed conversations. It's in the child's best interest, with the same ease as they framed receipts. "We can tie transactions to receipts at pawn shops and a series of withdrawals that correspond to dates you remember criticizing them." "Do they know we're watching?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, "and we need them to keep not knowing." I had imagined confrontation like a public unmasking with lights and a raised eyebrow. Instead, the truth moved in odd little ways. A voicemail Ethan left where he said, "We'll look after you, Mum," that had the wrong tone. A cashier at a florist who remembered a large cash payment the day Jessica bought tea for the office. Each fragment made a mosaic. Each mosaic formed a case. We had our strategy meeting the night the snow began to fall hard, the kind of weather that covers tracks and gives people excuses. Catherine sat at my table and pushed a thick envelope toward me. "This is the injunctive motion," she said. "We can freeze the accounts temporarily while we get formal discovery. If the judge agrees, they won't be able to touch the funds." "And Sophie?" I asked. My voice was suddenly small. "We petitioned for temporary guardianship during the investigation," Catherine said. "Given the circumstances, the court usually errs on the side of the child's safety. We can show financial manipulation as evidence of jeopardy." I remember the way the stove clock ticked in that small kitchen, the light above the sink throwing a rectangle across the battered formica. Outside, snowflakes made themselves into white flowers on the windowsill. I felt like a woman who had been given a map and a flashlight and told to go find a buried thing. I said yes to all of it. I did not imagine they would retaliate. I did not imagine that the men they had brought into our family could become the kind of people who would think themselves emboldened by dirt. They did not like being watched. People who profit by stealth resent someone who insists on light. They made their discomfort obvious in small goods. A vase moved from the mantel. A note from Jessica left on my chair that said, "Don't be difficult," like a command. A text from Ethan at 3 in the morning that read, "It will all be sorted. Trust me." Trust is a delicate currency. I had spent my life accepting the small betrayals of ordinary people, the late phone call, the postponed visit. But this was not ordinary. This took my independence and made it into their meal. The day it happened, the snow came down like a curtain. Catherine advised caution. "Don't go alone," she said, tying a scarf with the efficiency of a woman who had packed evidence in outerwear more than once. "Let Vincent come with you. We will not leave anything to chance." They laughed when I said I would go meet them. Ethan sounded amused on the phone, as if this were a domestic skirmish that would resolve itself over tea. "We can sort the accounts," he said, as if legitimate conversations could unmake what had already been done. "Come to the cabin. We'll all sit down. We'll be reasonable." I had said the cabin belonged to an old friend, a small place 40 miles north that had once been a holiday refuge and now was little more than a mortgage on memories. The map to the place was something they assumed I had, an old family habit to bring elders to neutral ground where signatures can be suggested and papers produced. I told them I would come. I wanted them to come. There is a brave foolishness in that wanting. Catherine advised a public setting. Vincent said the men needed the illusion of privacy to lower guard. If they feel they have options, they'll make mistakes, he told me. They'll reveal things in informal talk, and if anything goes wrong, there is a road and witnesses. His voice was careful. He knew how brittle adult confidence could be in the face of threat. We planned like chess players, Catherine with her motions, Vincent with his background work, me with my ledger and my face. The night before the meeting, I packed my small bag. I had always liked to travel light. The bag contained a spare sweater, a photograph of my husband, my ledger, and the letter copies. I left Sophie with a neighbor who had a son Sophie's age. Sophie kissed my cheek with a child's earnest certainty and said, "Be careful, Grandma." Her hair smelled like shampoo and crayons. I felt something like guilt in that kiss, a small hole shaped exactly like a child's palm. The road to the cabin was a white river. Ethan's voice had been casual. Jessica's had that superficial cheer you use in a life you are trying to sell. Ryan texted once, "Looking forward to your visit. We'll make sure everything is in order. XO. The smugness of that XO was a small insult. When we drove up the lane, the cabin showed itself like a storybook house. Smoke in the chimney, low and steady, a porch with a broken swing. I had been here with a husband who hummed old songs, and with children who made forts in the woodpile. I had more memory than property. The men were polite at first. They brewed coffee, poured it with hands that did not tremble, and we sat at the table where Catherine set out capers like a surgeon. "This will be a preliminary review," Catherine said evenly. "We will look at the accounts. We will agree on visibility for Sophie. We will not leave here without a protocol. You understand?" Ethan looked at me with a softness I once mistook for remorse. "Mom," he said, and I had to look away. "People think the sound of your name can do what you need to do. It doesn't." Conversations started as they always do, small concessions, mutual smiles. Then something shifted. Ryan, with his oily charm, produced a document and said, "It would be easier if we signed a mediated agreement now. We can take it to the bank. We can finalize the power of attorney. We'll all be better off." Catherine's voice narrowed. "We will proceed through counsel. You can sign a temporary hold, no transfers until disclosure." That's bureaucratic, Ryan said, and time is money.
A palabra money falls in conversation like a shovel. You hear it hit the floor. I reached for my cup and realized my hands were trembling, not from cold, but from a gathered anger. I had spent my life keeping the house and the budgets together. I had known how to tighten a stitch and how to count a day's receipts. They were speaking as if my years were a ledger to be balanced by people who had never earned their keep. It happened quickly, a motion, a shove, intended to be controlled. I should have seen the maneuvers, I tell myself now. But old houses have corners, and old people have less quickness. The cabin's floor was a treachery of stairs and rugs. They moved me from the kitchen toward the back, as if leading a stubborn cow. It was a small, domestic violence, firm hands on the upper arms, a suggestion that a chair would be comfortable. They told me softly that I should rest. Catherine stood like a sparrow ready to take flight. In the scuffle, someone knocked over a box of old keys. They skittered across the floor like a scattering of small, bright lies. Ethan's face was something else, focused for a moment on efficiency. I had loved that face as a child. I watched it turn into something that made the heart of a woman a ledger to be balanced. "We'll take a restroom," Jessica said. "We'll get hot water. We'll tidy you up. We'll make sure you're comfortable." They were already 2 steps ahead. Vincent, who had been parked down the lane with his engine idling, had said over the phone, quietly, "If they do anything, we move in." But movement is a complicated thing when a plan is based on the assumption of competent players. We had thought we had enough witnesses, enough leverage. We had not accounted for the way people, when cornered, will choose the quick and selfish way. They put me in what they called the barn because to them, a barn is a place to hide things you do not wish to air. It smelled of hay and old animal and a winter's dry manure. I'm not proud of the things I felt then. A sharp, stupid outrage that my son could make things like this happen. A deeper, more ancient fear that the world had decided to make me unnecessary. They locked the door from the outside. The lock was a small, triumphant sound, a tongue of metal finding a catch, and I traced it in my memory like a scar. At first, it was a daze. I told myself, I'll get someone. I'll shout until a neighbor hears. I'll open the door. But the snow was heavy. Their car disappeared in the white like a thought leaving a mind. They had left my handbag by the broken manger, my ledger half inside, and one of their gloves, a child's thing, in the wet. I was robbed of the most obvious thing, mobility. I had no coat. The night came in early. I drew my arms around myself and tried to make a little fire with hay, which was foolish. Hay smolders and then dies. Fire needs more than want. I thought about Sophie. Lydia sat with me and hummed tunes she told me she had learned from her grandmother. Catherine arrived with the relief of someone who had expected battle and found instead a neighborhood mobilized. Vincent, when he came inside and clapped his gloved hands together like a man who had not slept, said, "They left hurriedly. There's a patrol on the lane. We might catch up." Catherine's eyes sharpened in that way that turns small rooms into courtrooms. "Good. We'll need statements. Lydia, can you recount the tracks, the time?"
I saw a car at about 9, maybe 9:30, Lydia said. They were making a fuss about getting me to keep Sophie for a week. I thought it was odd. No, I thought it was wrong. I told myself not to mind. But then I saw them come back and go off in a hurry at 11. I'll take your statement, Vincent said. He spoke kindly, the way a man uses kindness to make a long job less ugly. We'll need someone to watch the phone lines in case they call Sophie. Keep her with you, Lydia. Do you mind? I'll watch her, Lydia said. She did not say she would be afraid. She did not allow the possibility into her voice. I sat and listened to the machinery of response. The law moves slowly, and sometimes it moves with surprising speed. It is both a saw and a bomb. That morning, the bomb arrived with people who had the habit of noticing. Catherine made calls, Vincent kept records, and Lydia brewed another pot of coffee. Sophie arrived with the neighbor's boy and his sister, small faces like little maps of relief. When Sophie saw me, she ran and wrapped both arms around me. Her face was wet from crying. She whispered, "Grandma," as if that word could make the furniture of the world come back together. Seeing her small, damp cheeks, I felt every ledger page fall away. The plan that had been a chess game became a matter of sheltering a child. We did not yet have the full case. We had shards. We had a neighbor's testimony. We had a car track and a witness who had the courage to follow suspicion like a thread. We had letters that smelled like lipstick and aftershave. We had a cold barn, and we had, most importantly, the knowledge that people who thought us easy prey had overreached. They had assumed that when you push an old woman into a barn and lock the door, no one would be interested enough to check. Ethan will not know it then, I thought, that his small cruelty would reveal him more than his careful thefts ever could. People who overreach do not often think about the small net of ordinary kindness. They think in transactions. They will be caught by affection the way a net catches a careless bird. We would pursue them, that was certain. But in that moment, as morning broadened and the broom of daylight cleared the hay from the beam of the barn, it was the small life, Lydia's steady presence, the neighbor child's hand in Sophie's, that felt like victory. Justice felt too big and distant. This felt like mending. They had left me to die in a place that smells like old animals and mistakes. They had thought that would solve everything. They had not imagined who would come at dawn to undo a piece of their plan by simply doing the human thing, noticing, caring, acting. For now, the legal gears would grind and evidence would be assembled and arrests might follow. But that morning, when Lydia found the tracks and came with a thermos and a warmth no money could buy, that morning felt like a reprieve. I thought then, with a clarity that comes from near loss, about the cost of things. If the law retook my money, would it bring Sophie back the same? If Ethan was punished, would his shame make him human again or hollow? The ledger of retribution is never neat. We would build evidence, and we would call the court to witness. Catherine would make the arguments. Vincent would tie the loose threads of money to the names of men who feast on the invisible. But the moral cost, the time that had been taken, the tenderness eroded by suspicion, that would be another ledger altogether. Sophie sat on my lap and scribbled with a borrowed pencil, drawing houses with high fences and little people waving from inside. She had not understood the machinery of adult greed, but she had felt its consequences. She asked me once, in the small voice children use when they are trying to understand grown-ups, "Will they go to jail?" "I don't know," I said. It was the truth. I had learned to answer children with truths that were not promises. "But we'll make sure you are safe." Catherine, meanwhile, had already placed a call to the county magistrate's office to file for emergency guardianship. Vincent had taken photographs of the barn lock and the tracks, and he had asked Lydia to recount every detail she could remember. The machine of law was slow, but deliberate. It needed facts and witnesses. Lydia was one. When the police siren finally threaded the clean, thin air, I saw Ethan across the lane, looking like a man who had been pulled together by a coin. He froze when he saw the police cars, then turned and fled. The sight of him bolt into the white was both grotesque and ordinary. Men who lack courage run like animals. I stood there wrapped in a blanket while officers took statements, while Catherine made sure Sophie was placed in someone safe's care for the day, while Vincent took my hand once, as if to measure human pulse. I felt a complicated relief, a small mercy that had been purchased by an unlikely neighbor and a stubbornness older than any lawyer. Later, as I sat by the stove with my tea warmed and my ledger open, I thought of the barn and how close I had been to thinking myself finished. The ledger was open, the handwriting careful. It felt like a map back to something you hope to defend but cannot guarantee. The evidence we had amassed would make a case, but the case would not bring back the sense of security I had once enjoyed. It would not unmake the nights of fear or entirely erase the betrayal that had come from under my own roof. But it would be a start. And the dawn had told me something else, that people you have fed and watered and noticed all your life will not always remain invisible when you need them most. They will show up at doors with thermoses and blankets. They will follow car tracks like small, patient detectives of the common. They will be the unexpected detail that transforms a tragedy into an opportunity for justice. Even so, the road ahead was long. There would be bank audits and sworn statements and hearings where men in suits would look at my face and attempt to measure whether the lines there were of frailty or of truth. Ethan would be in the middle of it, and I would have to speak of him in terms that would not be synonyms for hatred. Betrayal, yes, but also a son whose failures I would have to account for in court. That was the thing that made my hands shake anew. I had been rescued from the barn, not by authority, but by neighborhood. And perhaps that was the truest justice I could imagine at dawn. It was small, awkward, human. It did not tie up every loose account. It would not be the end of the story, but it made a space for the next move. They had left me in a freezing barn to die. They had expected no consequence beyond the convenience of erasure. They had never imagined who would show up at dawn. I drank my tea and wrote the time in my ledger. The numbers would not fix everything, but they would help. At the bottom of the page, I drew a small key, a private symbol. The line beneath it read, "Keep, protect, remember." Outside, the snow smoothed the car tracks into a white hesitation, a thing that could be read differently if you did not know what to look for. The world would look the same to someone who preferred to wash away ugliness. But to me, to Catherine, to Vincent, to Lydia, the marks were a map. We would follow it. The legal part of it had to start within the week. There would be motions to file, banks to persuade, and an inevitable public humiliation. I felt the first sting of victory and a colder, quieter ache that triumph had come at a price. The price was the fragments of intimacy consumed in the process. The price was the knowledge that I had to choose between the comfort of forgetting and the harder, necessary work of truth. I closed the ledger and folded it into my bag. Sophie drew another house. Lydia hummed. Outside, someone shouted in the distance, an officer's voice, and a car's engine cut through the soft white. The morning continued, not heroic, but real. There would be a courtroom. There would be evidence. There would be a moment when I would have to speak my son's name aloud and be both mother and witness. It would be necessary and terrible in equal measures. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era without theatrics and asked necessary questions. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Ethan's attorney opened with a practiced coolness. A man had his reasons. A family was fractured. Haste had led to misinterpretation. The judge listened. My lawyer unfolded the photographs, the receipts, the bank statements, the statements of neighbors. Lydia spoke first when asked. Her voice did not quaver. Vincent described finding me in the barn and the purchase that had prevented the sale of the stranger to a stranger. Catherine recounted the thermoses and the blankets. Sophie held my hand in the gallery and traced the edge of my coat with small, sure fingers. Then it was my turn. My throat tightened when I said his name aloud, Ethan. The room seemed to pull taut. I spoke of dates, of money, of signatures. I spoke of the night in the barn without theatricality, the way one reads an inventory. Broken latch, missing insulation, the smell of kerosene and old hay. The law wanted particulars. My voice supplied them. Ethan watched me from across the room. He looked smaller than I had imagined, and older in a way that did not reconcile easily with compassion. When I spoke of him as a son, the word landed differently. It was not an invocation of soft memory, but a fact among many. "Do you want anything from me?" he asked quietly when the judge excused the room and a thin crowd remained clustered around the door. I thought of forgiveness as something not owed to the guilty, but as a space I could choose to inhabit for my own step. "I want the truth to be known," I said. "I want the harm undone where it can be undone. And I want him to be held accountable, whatever that accountability looks like." He flinched, not at the words, but at the steadiness of them. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was not a defense, nor a legal strategy. It was a small human sound. The judge granted the temporary orders and scheduled a full hearing. The press did not notice us yet. We were still a small inventory of broken things. But the ledger was being replicated page by page inside legal files and in the careful palms of neighbors who had seen more than they expected to see. At night, I returned to the ledger and wrote the new dates. Depositions taken, witnesses sworn, an injunction issued. Beneath a map of the transactions, I added, in a hand that felt both tired and resolute, another note. Keep, protect, remember. The key I had drawn earlier looked less like a symbol now and more like a hinge on which a door might swing. Outside, snow arrived again and settled with the same indifferent patience as before. The car tracks erased and reappeared. The world offered its neat forgettings. But inside the warm rooms where we gathered to plan and to wait, the neighborhood had become a ledger of another sort. Entries written in the small acts of care. Homemade stew left on the porch. A child offered a drawing to cheer the groan. A neighbor's coat lent without question. The legal war was only beginning.
There old killed question. The legal war was only beginning. There would be hearings, encounters, motions, and perhaps humiliations that would come unbidden. There would be the difficult decision about whether to press charges in full, to seek restitution for damaged property, and for the betrayals that could not be measured in sums. There would be a trial if necessary, an airing of private wrongs. But for the present, as the house hummed in the thin winter dark, I felt something like steadiness. Lydia hummed while she sorted papers. Vincent slept in the chair downstairs after having stood watch the previous night. Sophie fell asleep with a crayon smudge on her chin. I closed the ledger and placed the little drawn key on top of it, as if to give the symbol a real weight. If justice had a slow pulse, we had discovered that the neighborhood did not. It breathed in small, persistent acts and kept time with them. The world outside could smooth over tracks. Inside, people remembered. They testified. They held. That, in the end, might be the truest form of reckoning, less the court's gavel than the persistent ledger of who had cared enough to show up. In the morning, I would meet with Mr. Hargreaves again. There would be more signatures to procure and more statements to formalize. The road would not be short, and the ledger of consequences would grow longer. But when Lydia kissed my forehead and whispered, "We'll be here," I believed her. We were not done. We had only begun to turn the pages.